Aerial gunnery in the days of the Second World War was one of the hardest things to train for. The crews of Allied bombers had to rely on films and crude towed targets to practice for the real thing. Of course, the real thing was much more unpredictable, fast, and deadly. Gunning down an incoming German or Japanese fighter to save yourself and your crew is a far cry from the simplistic training done in the States. They could come in at any angle, at any speed, and if you weren't fast enough, you'd find yourself dangling from silk. If you were lucky. The Army Air Corps had to find a better way to train their gunners to ease their trial by fire. The hardy P-63 King Cobra was selected for the task, which was to be shot at with live ammunition by bomber crews. The 63s were painted in a blaze orange and modified to take the punishment from fire slung at them from their fellow Americans. A notable modification, a hit indicator light on the nose, earned the project its nickname, Pinball. Established in June 1941, before the US was even involved in World War II, the first school for flexible gunnery sprouted up in Las Vegas. Despite being a desert environment, the school could rely on clear skies and a stable air temperature year-round. As the war grew the need for more aerial gunners, other schools began to open across the country. 6 locations opened up like chain restaurants from Arizona and Texas to Florida. I can only imagine how much of a pain in the ass it was to try and instruct students through the hurricane season, but I digress. World War II saw a new kind of aerial combat. Unlike the Great War, massive formations of bombers formed the backbone of the strategic bomber concept. Bomber forces could strike deep within enemy territory and destroy military targets, infrastructure, and supply lines. In the European theater of operation, the US Army Air Corps took on the daylight bombing duties over occupied Europe. Initially, the bomber forces were unprotected as it was thought that they packed enough firepower on flexible turrets to deter any interceptor attacks. By 1942, however, it was clear that bomber attrition was too costly. Not only were the unescorted bombers easy pickings for the Luftwaffe, the gunners had little luck in hitting the incoming fighters. Training aerial gunnery in a realistic way was nigh impossible in the 1940s. There were no simulators that could offer a convincing training course. Hell, the best gunnery schools could think up at first was to have students shoot at clay pigeons with shotguns. I actually used to do this as a hobby, and given my personal experience, I can imagine it built up the fundamentals needed to lead targets, but probably wouldn't do much to translate into machine gun firing at 30,000 feet. As time went on, other training methods came onto the scene, such as the Waller Gunnery Simulator, which projected film of incoming enemy aircraft. Of course, it was still a far cry from the real thing. Even towed targets were tested, but it wasn't enough. A new technique was needed, something more real. Enter Major Cameron Fairchild and Paul Gross. In a desperate bid to aid in gunnery training, Major Fairchild, then stationed at the Harlingen Gunnery School in Texas, wrote several universities. He had a concept in mind that would involve shooting at real piloted aircraft. Insane, right? Well, not if the projectiles fired were designed to not cause any harm to the fighter. Paul Gross, the director of scientific research at Duke University, took on the challenge. Several materials were tested for a projectile that would shatter on impact with the intent to not even so much as scratch the plane's paint job. Working closely with Marcus Hobbs, a chemistry professor, Gross tested their frangible projectiles with .22 caliber rifles. A glass and bakelite composite proved promising. By July of 1942, the concept moved forward into the development of a full-scale rifle round that could be fired from a .30 caliber machine gun. For the next 2 years, the scientists worked closely with Fairchild, who spearheaded the project for the Army Air Corps. In 1943, the first molds for producing the frangible rounds were developed by the Bakelite Corporation, which greatly helped the manufacturing process. Until this point, all of the test rounds had been handmade. Officially dubbed Ball, Frangible, Caliber 30, T-44, the crumbling round packed a lower powder charge than the standard .30-06 round. To allow a machine gun to cycle the experimental ammunition, Duke scientists under Gross and Hobbs modified a .30 caliber with a gas-powered piston booster at the muzzle. This would increase the amount of gases running back into the machine gun to allow proper operation. That alone would make for an interesting video. I'm sure Forgotten Weapons would love to cover something like that if they can get their hands on one. While the 30 caliber machine gun was smaller than the 50 cals on B-17s and B-24s, the operation of the gun was the same and the ballistics of the rounds scaled well enough to offer an effective analog. The gun and the ammunition was ready, and multiple examples were mounted onto a YB-40 nicknamed Pea Shooter. But what would the target be? The first real-world test saw an A-20 Havoc, Alclad NAG, making runs past the Pea Shooter. Crewed by Chuck Everett and J.B. Rowan, the NAG's pilots were only told that they would be testing new ammunition. It was never fully expressed to them that they would be the target until after they had volunteered for the project. The first trial saw the NAG peppered by frangible rounds, which successfully shattered and left no visible damage on the plane. The second day, the A-20 repeated the run on the YB-40, only for an engine to cut out. Luckily, Everett was able to limp the A-20 home and land at a divert field. The close shave would have ended the frangible bullet experiments then and there, if the accident was actually caused by one of them. A close look over the aircraft showed that the engine stoppage was caused by an unrelated mechanical fault. After more testing with the A-20, the decision was made to go ahead with a better fighter analog. The success of the Alclad NAG experiments landed frangible bullet training as part of the Flexible Gunnery School's syllabus. The A-20, however, needed to be replaced with a more nimble fighter which, at the time, needed to be strong enough to take the beating the NAG could. They may have been frangible rounds, but the experimental ammunition could still cause damage if it hit the right spot. There were fears that the pilot could be hit as well as the softer engine components. The fighter to take the onslaught would need to have a configuration ideal for, well, being shot at. The answer came in the form of the P-63 King Cobra. The P-63 was the evolution of the earlier P-39 Airacobra developed by the Bell Company in Buffalo, New York. While the P-39 didn't see much service in the US, having been considered obsolete by the war's outset, the little fighter was beloved by the Soviets, who made great use of them against the Axis. The P-39 had a very unique arrangement. The Allison V-12 engine was actually positioned behind the pilot, which meant the propeller's drive shaft ran just beneath the pilot's legs. The placement of the engine allowed for a 37mm cannon to be installed in the nose, with the muzzle resting in the prop hub. The cannon was used to great effect on the Eastern Front, allowing the Soviets to pop lightly armored vehicles and entrenchments. There's talk that they were able to kill tanks with it too, however, any information regarding that is pretty dubious, but we'll get into that sometime. The cockpit was unique as well. The pilot sat low under the canopy and entered the craft via side doors, much like a car. Despite the lack of success in the Army Air Corps, the boys over at Bell felt that they could improve on the design. On December 7, 1942, 1 year to the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Bell's new XP-63 took to the air. A series of superchargers and a 4-bladed propeller added to the King Cobra allowed it to operate effectively at higher altitudes, and armament improvements brought it back in line with more modern aircraft. Instead of the two 30 cals, two 50 cals, and a 37 Mike, the King Cobra was armed with 4 50 cals, which would increase firepower while at the same time making procuring ammunition easier. The beast of a plane retained the autocannon in the nose, which was most welcomed by the European allies we were exporting to. The souped-up Cobra could also carry 1,500 pounds of ordnance in its wings. Despite the improvements, the Army Air Forces never adopted the King Cobra for frontline combat duties, since we already had the P-51s and 47s. Honestly, the situation made the 63 all the better for Major Fairchild's project. Using the P-63 wouldn't detract from any of the frontline fighter supplies or maintenance personnel. The P-63 was also an ideal candidate as it looked very similar to a German Bf-109 from the front. The rear engine arrangement also meant that it would be protected from any incoming fire from head-on. You can't just throw a stock King Cobra into the mix, however. Modifying the King Cobras was a bit of an arduous task. Initially, 5 P-63As were acquired by the gunnery schools, who began tinkering on them by July 1944. The King Cobras, redesignated RP-63A, R meaning restricted from combat, had all of their armor and weapons stripped from them. The Sperry Gyroscope Company developed an intricate radiosonic device intended for picking up detonations in internal combustion engines. The same system was adapted for use underneath the skin of the RP-63 as a sort of nervous system. Any impact of a frangible round could be detected and send a signal to a bright red light in the nose of the plane. The light, having taken the place of the cannon, looked much like a light in a pinball machine, earning the project its title. A hit counter in the Cobra's cockpit would also notify the pilot of any hits. In addition to the quasi-nervous system in the newly dubbed pinball, additional armor plating was positioned around the aircraft to protect the pilot and vital flight surfaces. Finally, each one of the RP-63s was painted blaze orange, as was the custom of experimental aircraft in the 1940s. 95 other P-63As and 200 C models would receive the same pinball treatment. Eventually, the program became so successful that a dedicated model, the RP-63G, was built from the ground up just for the pinball duty. In addition to the nose light, the later pinball Cobras would have wingtip lights added to further notify the trainee gunner of a hit. Throughout 1944 and 1945, flexible gunnery schools across the United States fired 13 million rounds of frangible bullets. Both the round and the modified King Cobras did their jobs, and surprisingly, not a single pilot was killed in the hazardous duty. Despite the success of the technology, it is up for debate how helpful the training regimen was given the war ended in the middle of 1945. After the war, the Strategic Air Command maintained the flexible gunnery training program until 1947, when the cost of the program was deemed too expensive. In the end, all of the Pinball 63s were mothballed. Improvements in technology meant that defensive aircraft guns were obsolete, and most Cold War bombers reduced their gun batteries to just the tail position. I did a video covering the last of the tail gunners here. I think you'll like it if you enjoyed this sort of prequel. As for the last of the P-63s, there are very few still around, let alone ones that we know for a fact were part of the pinball program. Sadly, a P-63F owned by the Commemorative Air Force was lost along with its pilot, Craig Hutane, in a mid-air collision with B-17 Texas Raiders. My podcast co-host Anna Markey did well to explain the incident, and I'll make sure the link is in the description. Pinball was a forgotten operation with a forgotten plane, but it left its mark on history. It further advanced how training regimens are formed in the military, showed how high-tech avionics can be installed in research aircraft for experiments, and built military and academic ties. If you want to learn more about pinball, I highly recommend Operation Pinball by Ivan Hickman. He's one of the original guys who served at Kingman Gunnery School during the pinball days. It's been a hell of a source of information, and honestly, it's amazing what you'll find in a book that you can't find online. Thanks to Ghoul for sending me a copy and letting me know about the project. This is all because of you, man. Now, I'm thinking of doing an experiment down the road if this video gets off the ground. I'd like to get some T-44 ammunition of my own to test against aircraft skin. I'd really like to see how the frangible rounds work in person. Of course, if I do this, I'll be sure to film it for, scientific purposes. Now, the ammunition isn't cheap, it's like $3 or $4 a round, and that's where you guys would come in. If you're interested in helping me out on future projects, my Patreon is in the description. I'd really appreciate the support. That being said, thanks to everybody who's already supporting me. It means a lot more than you know. As always, keep that sun on your back. See you around, guys.